I have something to confess. I'm addicted. But look, I've got some boring news for you. You probably are too, you know? Every time I heard the words addiction or junkie, the first thing that came to mind was that image of a guy living on the street, all drugged up. That was the stereotype that had stuck in my head since childhood, and that's why, for a long time, I didn't even consider myself a real addict. If this is your idea of addiction, you probably think it has nothing to do with you. But addiction can be present in other everyday actions that nobody would care about, even if you indulge in them. Things like shopping, surfing the internet, eating fast food, working, scrolling through your phone, drinking coffee, playing games, practicing RuneScape, huh? It's not just limited to alcoholics and drug users, you know? So, what I'm going to talk about today is relevant to everyone, because I believe that most of us are addicted to something, even if we don't know it or don't want to admit it. At least, we all have behaviors that we want to stop or reduce. And to improve your life, you don't necessarily need to add a bunch of new habits, but rather eliminate the ones that are holding you back. Of course, most of the things I've mentioned are acceptable when done in moderation. Someone who drinks occasionally isn't necessarily an addict, they're just making a bad choice. What really defines addiction is excessive and compulsive consumption, what you keep doing despite the negative consequences you feel or impose on others. If you repeat a behavior without being able to reduce or stop it, you're an addict. But the problem is that the most common thing an addict tells themselves is that they're not really addicted, that they can stop at any time and that they don't even want to or see any reason to stop. They make excuses to justify their behavior. So a good question to ask yourself is, can you completely stop this behavior for a few weeks? Can you do without your cell phone, sugar, coffee, or computer during that time? If we're honest, for many of us the answer is no. And it's worth taking a closer look at why that is. Because the easiest way to control your behavior is to understand why you're doing it in the first place. Cravings and addiction. We all have cravings. And our addiction, although it can be problematic, is usually a solution we find to satisfy those cravings. You see, if our behavior didn't benefit us in some way, we wouldn't repeat it. In other words, we are addicted to our drug of choice because it satisfies a specific purpose. For some people, it's seeking pleasure. Of course, everyone wants to feel good. Maybe you want to feel the excitement of discovering something new, so you go online and scour social media. Or maybe you want to have fun and turn to sports betting or video games. However, our behavior is not only driven by desires, but also by life's problems and difficulties. Another reason behind our behavior is to avoid pain. I believe this is the most common driving force for most people. Of course, nobody wants to feel bad. We want to escape that pain. So when you're stressed or overwhelmed, you overeat or smoke to exchange the bad feelings for good ones. Maybe you feel lonely or bored and go shopping or gambling to distract your mind from these depressing thoughts. You might feel powerless or empty and spend all day watching Netflix series to distract yourself. I could go on and on. But whether it's the search for pleasure or the escape from pain, you've probably noticed in your own life that you tend to resort to highly dopaminergic behaviors or substances as a solution. In other words, when you indulge in these activities, your brain releases a large amount of dopamine. And as you probably already know, dopamine is a neurotransmitter linked to motivation, desire, and drive. Every time it is released, your mood tends to improve and you feel great. However, the more dopamine an activity releases and the faster it is released, the more addictive it becomes. You need to be very careful at this point. Although the strategy of indulging in highly dopaminergic activities can lift your mood in the short term, it can make your life worse in the long term. Pain and pleasure. In the book The Dopamine Nation, Anna Lemke, an addiction specialist and professor at Stanford University, describes a very important process. She explains how pain and pleasure are processed in the same region of the brain and, more importantly, how they work as a balance. This is something I didn't know until recently, but it's an absolutely crucial aspect of how we function in everyday life. Imagine that your brain is a scale. When it's empty, it's perfectly even and balanced. However, when you indulge in a pleasurable, dopamine-rich activity, the balance shifts. The more exciting the behavior, the faster the balance shifts and the more pleasure you feel. But here's the thing about balance. It wants to remain even, in other words, it wants to avoid extremes. When you indulge in intensely pleasurable behavior, the brain begins to perceive this as an imbalance. To compensate, it makes adjustments. How? By reducing your sensitivity to dopamine. In this way, the pleasure you initially feel from the behavior diminishes over time. In other words, you need more of the same thing to get the same feeling of pleasure you had at the beginning. This is where the search for dopamine becomes a problem. Reduced sensitivity to dopamine is not selective. It affects all areas of your life. This means that, over time, not only does pleasurable behavior lose its luster, but other areas of your life also start to lose their color. This is why many people fall into the trap of addiction without realizing it. They don't realize that by seeking instant pleasure and fleeing pain at all costs, they are sacrificing the overall quality of their lives. That doesn't sound like a good deal, does it? So the truth is that we all have a legitimate desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem arises when we get stuck in patterns of behavior that, although they provide us with short-term relief, harm us in the long term. The solution: awareness and choice. So what's the way out? How do we escape this cycle? The answer lies in awareness and choice. Once we understand the patterns that keep us stuck, we can make informed decisions to change our behavior. First, it's essential to recognize that you are seeking immediate pleasure or avoiding pain at all costs. When you feel the urge to resort to a habitual behavior, take a moment to ask yourself, am I doing this to seek instant pleasure or am I avoiding some discomfort? After recognizing the pattern, comes the part of making a conscious choice. Ask yourself, is this choice in line with my values and long-term goals? Will it lead me to a more meaningful and healthy life? If the answer is no, consider other options that will help you deal with your desires and emotions in a more positive way. The key is to realize that you have the power of choice. You don't have to be controlled by the impulse of the moment. You can choose to direct your behavior in a way that benefits you in the long term, rather than just providing temporary relief. So, guys, it's all in your hands. If you want your life to improve, start by observing your patterns, understanding your underlying desires and emotions, and making conscious choices that take you in the direction you really want to go.